This video is for anyone who is on the fence with whether or not to purchase the new goggles from DJI, the DJI Goggles Integra. If you're like me and you've had the V2s, or maybe you don't have a pair of goggles yet and you're wondering which ones are the right ones for you, you've got the V2s, you have the Goggles 2, and then now these Goggles Integra. I'm here to tell you what my opinions are. I came from the V2s, I skipped the Goggles 2, and then I just purchased the Goggles Integra. You could check out my previous video with the unboxing and my initial impressions. Go ahead and click that link. But now that I've had some time to actually use the Goggles Integra, I have some opinions. I've got my first impressions here. I've used them for a couple of hours over the course of the past several days. So I've got plenty of flight time with the new Goggles Integra, and I have some pretty firm opinions about what I think would be the good, the bad, the ugly, and the unknown. So that table that you're looking at here, this is something that I created, and this is just after my time thinking about, using these, how do they compare to the V2s, and just in general for flying FPV, how do these things hold up? Now, just a little bit about me. I am a professional drone pilot, kind of my full-time gig, but it's something that I do for occasional jobs. And of course, I fly recreationally, just for fun. So I do a lot of cinematic flying. I do some freestyle flying, and I also fly some other stuff like Mavics and things like that. So I'm not really into hardcore racing or extreme long range. So keep that in mind. All of my opinions here are my own, and it is just for my specific uses that have already kind of gone over there for cinematic flying, and nothing too crazy with long range. So anyway, let's get into it. Let's start with the good. And right off the bat, you see I have a lot more listed in good than any other column. It's a good thing. I have very good feelings about these goggles. I don't regret purchasing them so far. Hopefully that doesn't change. Compared to the V2s, there's a lot of good stuff to say here. And we'll get into the bad stuff and the ugly stuff later. So let's start with the price point. This is in no particular order or anything like that, so I just kind of threw everything in there. But the price point was nice. Now, I had two pairs of the Goggles V2 that I purchased for $569 back when they were at full MSRP. I believe you can find them now for about $429. Now, the Goggles 2, when they released, that's $650, which is pretty steep. Now, that was one of the main reasons why I avoided those at first, but the Goggles Integra coming in at $499, absolutely a welcome price point. Now, as for the actual displays, the OLED displays, which are the same OLED panels that are in the Goggles 2, the Integra OLED displays, a huge upgrade over the Goggles V2. So coming from LCD, it definitely has a much clearer, sharper image, coming from 810p with the V2 to a full 1080p with OLED, so it's not only clear, it's also much more colorful, and those colors really do pop. So that was pretty impressive, especially just as starting up the goggles, just seeing that DJI logo on a black background with an OLED black background. So you couldn't see any kind of gray glow. It was just true black, which really helps the colors stand out. The integrated battery of the Integra is a very welcome addition. It's one of the major reasons that I purchased it. I don't like having, something hanging off of my head when I'm trying to fly FPV. It gets in the way and it just becomes a problem. I've had the battery accidentally unplug in my pocket before. I lost signal and crashed my drone. So that integrated battery, while it's not exactly replaceable, I'll get into that later, it is nice to have it there, and it's just there. And as long as it's charged, you don't really have anything else to think about. No extra wires. The integrated remote ID, again, I don't have to plug my phone into the goggles to be able to start my Avata. If you're flying a drone like the Avata, that requires remote ID. So far, that's really the only one that we're dealing with right now, but could be some more coming down the pike. It was a nuisance, especially with the latest firmware updates that started requiring GPS positioning. So DJI had to report, the pilot's location. And the best way for them to do that with the older goggles that didn't have remote ID was to plug in a phone that had GPS. Now with the Goggles Integra, that's built in. You really can just put the goggles on, turn them on, and you're good to go. You don't have anything else to worry about as far as connecting. Device switching. Another huge reason why I wanted these in the first place, I have a lot of drones. I have the Avata. I've got several quads that are running Caddx Vista units. I think I've got like 9 of them. And then I have a quad with the new DJI O3 air unit that's in my Synologue 35. And then I also have the DJI FPV drone. So I have 11 drones. And as I was using my V2s, I was running into issues where if I wanted to fly the FPV, if I wanted to fly the Avata, and I was switching back and forth between them, I found that I kept having to rebind the drones to the goggles because the goggles essentially forgot. And every time I would switch modes, it wouldn't remember. And if you know that switching between flight modes in those goggles, it's a nuisance. You have to go through the menus, you have to select the kind of mode that you want, so Avata, and then you have to turn off the goggles, and then you have to turn them back on, and then you're good. But then you have to rebind. Really wasn't fun. So device switching has been completely fixed for the Goggles Integra. I'm sure it's the same way with the Goggles too. I just haven't used them myself, so I'm not certain on that.
So I realized during editing here that I skipped over Caddx Vista support and bound device recall. So for Caddx Vista support, I still am running quite a few quads that have Caddx Vista units installed in them. I think at 7, maybe. But anyway, I realized pretty quickly that I had to update the firmware in the Vista units in order for them to be recognized by the Goggles Integra. So I had to plug in my Vista units to the DJI Assistant, because after all, that is DJI hardware out of Caddx Vista units. I had to use the DJI Assistant FPV drone series in order for it to be recognized. And I always have some issues with that. It just never really works perfectly the first time. But anyway, after unplugging and replugging and power cycling a few times, it eventually ended up finding and recognizing the Vista that was plugged in. It comes in as a FPV drone, FPV air unit light, something like that. I had a couple network errors. I had to refresh a couple times. So if you do have trouble updating your Caddx Vistas to the latest firmware, just be persistent, hit refresh, unplug, replug, just do the general troubleshooting things eventually until it finally will take, and hopefully your Vistas won't overheat during the update process. After you update, the goggles should recognize the Vistas no problem as long as you're in the right mode within the goggles. And yeah, you should be good to go. I just have to get through updating all of my drones now. For bound device recall, it is absolutely perfect. I have had no issues with either the Avata, the O3, or my Caddx Vista units. So I have bound, at this point, 4 different Vista units, the O3 and the Avata, all to my Goggles Integra, and I can seamlessly switch back and forth between all of them without having to rebind anything. I don't know if there's a limit for how many Caddx Vista air units you can bind to the Goggles Integra before you have to start rebinding or something like that, but so far so good, and everything seems to be working seamlessly, as I said. So good job, DJI. That is a major improvement over the Goggles V2.
And next is there's no pinhole bind button on the Goggles Integra. I'm pretty sure that I know the V2 had the pinhole bind button. You had to hold it in to get the goggles to enter pairing mode. I'm not certain about the Goggles 2. I think it probably had a pinhole bind button because it did use the external battery just like the V2s. But now to bind, all you have to do is hold the power button when the goggles are on until it beeps, and then it's in pairing mode. So the reason I like that is because I didn't have to remember to bring anything small enough to punch through and push that little button. I ran into a couple situations where I was using mulch to bind a drone to goggles because I didn't remember to bring anything small enough, and I had to look around me to see what I could find. So it's nice to not have to worry about that anymore. The next thing we have here is there's no touchpad. The Goggles 2 had that new touch sensor on the side to be able to switch between and navigate menus and things like that. And I'm not a huge fan of the touch sensor, and especially since it's something that I can see myself accidentally brushing against when I'm trying to do something, or accidentally swiping the wrong direction, whatever. So it's nice to have that joystick back, especially since that's what I'm used to with the Goggles V2. All right. Next up here. So instead of the touchpad, the Goggles Integra have the joystick, same joystick, but it is a little bit larger than the one that is found on the Goggles V2. So it has a great feel to it. and it clicks. It's exactly the same kind of functionality. And if you're comparing the Goggles 2 to the Goggles Integra, it's the same kind of thing, like a swipe down, you just push down in the direction with the joystick. So all the same functionality there. It's just exact like how you trigger those motions is either a physical switch instead of the touchpad operation that's found on the Goggles 2.
The joystick that's found on the Goggles Integra is slightly larger than the one that is found on the Goggles V2. So it does the same exact thing. It's just slightly larger, and not very much larger, just a little bit. We're talking like maybe a millimeter, half a millimeter, something like that. Does exactly the same thing, but larger, I guess, is slightly better. It is very easy to find it. If you are in the goggles and you put your hand up there, it's not hard to find where the joystick actually is, and navigation feels good. So really, that's all I have to say about that.
Next, the goggles themselves, the Goggles V2. And I'm sure the Goggles 2 do this as well. The boot time compared to the Goggles V2 is dramatically faster. I remember with my V2, and I still use my V2s, when you power on the V2s, you put them up to your eyes, you see DJI for a good while until you can actually see any of your menus. And what happens is it shows DJI, and then it shows you your camera feed if you have a drone bound to it. And then you still can't do anything. You have to wait another like 20 seconds. And then finally you can access the menus and do stuff. With the Goggles Integra, usually I power them up, and by the time I put them up to my eyes a couple seconds later, it's fully booted and ready to go. Huge for convenience, and it's really nice to not have to, sit there and wait like an idiot looking at my goggles to see if they're booted up. So good job, DJI. Whatever processor is running, the guts of this thing, it's definitely speedier and it's much appreciated. Quiet operation. There are many times that I've turned on the Goggles V2 and that fan just really is noticeable how loud it is just from turning it on before it even gets warm. It's a noisy little unit, and I haven't noticed as much noise coming from the Goggles Integra, so not a huge deal, but it is a welcome one. The auto power off. Since it has an integrated battery, I was kind of concerned that, if I forgot to turn it off, is it going to overheat if I have it in a bag, or is it going to kill my battery because I forgot to turn it off and then it's idling and I'm, in between locations on a shoot or something. I was pleasantly surprised that it does have an auto off feature that's enabled by default. It starts to beep to warn you. And then if you look in the lens, it'll tell you, there's no activity detected, turning off in 50 seconds, something like that. So nice welcome feature that does help prevent some unnecessary battery drainage. Next, we have the smaller size. So obviously the Goggles Integra and the Goggles 2 are significantly smaller than the Goggles V2. So I wasn't too concerned with the size. It's not like I'm going out, to look good when I'm flying FPV. I'm putting goggles on and I don't really care what I look like, but now that I have a smaller headset on, it's kind of nice. It's not weighing me down as much, I guess. And more importantly, it takes up less room in my bag. So when I'm packing things up, usually I'm bringing multiple goggles. I'm bringing batteries, drones, just all the things. And my bag, I don't want to get a bigger bag to fit all of this stuff. So now I actually get some room back with a smaller set of goggles. The build quality. Pretty much anything from DJI, I'm impressed with the build quality. It looks good, it feels good, and for the most part, everything seems durable. I've dropped my V2 several times, usually when I walk away, when the battery pack is still in my pocket and it pulls it off of the table. But I am confident with that when it does fall like that, it's not going to, shatter into a million pieces. I've never had any issues outside of a couple little dings and scratches on the V2s, and I feel pretty much the same way that if I would happen to drop my Goggles Integra, that they're not really going to be super fragile and fall apart. At least hopefully anyway. We shall see. Next, they're pretty lightweight. So they feel really good when they're on your head. We'll talk more about the foam and the comfort of them a little bit later here. But as far as the entire unit with the battery in the back and the goggles in the front, it doesn't feel heavy on my head, which is nice. And that really helps because I don't have the wires coming off and whatever extra weight that adds on. It feels good and balanced on my head when it's all kind of on and assembled and I'm using it. So it's something that I've been pretty happy with. Next up, we've got no touchpad, which we've already talked about, but really the fact that they brought that joystick back was awesome. The latency, we're looking at around the same latency as the Goggles 2 and the V2. I believe the V2 may have had slightly better latency or less latency because of the faster response time with the 120 hertz, I believe it was, refresh rate compared to the 100 hertz refresh rate found in the Goggles 2 and the Goggles Integra. But either way, super fast, a very low latency. Next is the foldable antennas. Now I have this listed in the good column here, but it comes up again in one of the other columns. We'll get into that. But the foldable antennas is nice, again, for bag storage. So being able to fold the antennas flat and not having to take the time to unscrew them and remove them to store the goggles safely so you're not risking damaging the antennas, it's nice. It adds to the convenience and it gives you some of that storage space back. Now the audience sharing. I still have my V2 goggles. And I did test the audience sharing. I had no problems pairing the V2s to the Integra's feed. So I was flying from the Integras with the Avata and the O3. I used my V2 goggles to patch into the audience feed and it worked just fine. I did not have any success patching into the audience feed with one of my drones, a couple of my drones. I tried it on with the Caddx Vista unit. So I was able to fly the Caddx Vista drones with the Goggles Integra, but I could not find a way to activate audience feed with the V2s trying to patch into the Integras. So whether or not that's something I'm overlooking or if there's another firmware update that came out, I did update all of my firmware for the goggles and for the Caddx Vista units that were in my quads. I just couldn't figure it out. So I gave up. I'll have to look into that a little bit more, but I did try for a good solid 20, 30 minutes. Couldn't figure it out. Anyway, power bank charging. Integrated battery. I was initially concerned that I wouldn't be able to put a new battery in my goggles if, I ran out of juice on a shoot or something. And the battery life is great. Talking about that pretty soon. But if I read that if you are having low battery, you can pop in through the USB-C on the Goggles Integra and charge while the goggles are in use, which could theoretically, I guess, be unlimited use if you keep swapping out power banks, which is great. I'm going to have to look into a slim or low profile kind of power bank, something that maybe I can attach to the strap or something like that. Just, I do not want to get back into something in my pocket connected to the goggles at any point. I'm over that. All right. Next up, we have the microSD support from the Goggles Integra has been bumped up to 512 gigabytes. Now that's from 256 supported on the V2s as well as the Goggles 2. So it's nice to see a little bump there just for recording your DVR feed, especially now that we're recording at 1080p, 60 frames per second. Really nice to see that added capacity supported on the Goggles Integra. And that is, again, a bump up from the Goggles 2 as well. Goggles 2, according to DJI's site, cap out as the capacity at 256 gigs. Head tracking support. I thought when I was looking into the Goggles Integra that they dropped this as a feature, but apparently they didn't. So the Goggles Integra do support head tracking as long as you're using a drone that supports it, like the Avata, and you also have the motion controller activated as well. I'm not interested in head tracking. That's not something I'm looking to do, but it's kind of nice to know that the goggles do support it if I ever decide to have my kids use the goggles and some of the motion controls or other beginners who might be interested in that feature. Next up. So I mentioned that DVR recording with the microSD. The Goggles Integra are capable of recording the screens from the OLED screens anyway at a full 1080p 60 frames per second, just your DVR footage, directly to the SD card that is in your goggles. The reason I really like that is because you got nice usable footage that is way better than what the V2s were capable of, down to 720p, I believe, or 810, whatever it was. But one of the reasons why I like that as a feature is if you crash a drone, especially an expensive drone, and you lose it somewhere in a field or something like that, you still have footage of that crash to the moment where you lost signal or whatever it was. You can review that footage in your goggles to help you locate where your drone went down. As an example, one time I was flying one of my drones around a park with a wooded area, and I clipped the top of a tree. The drone started going a crash course toward the ground, and I ended up having to kill the props. And I lost my feed. So I ended up watching the footage in my goggles of, where I hit. And as I was going down, the last moment before I lost my signal and the video feed cut, I noticed a formation of trees. So I walked till I found that formation and just kind of started walking in a circle. And sure enough, I found my drone before too long. Had I not had that footage, I think it would have taken me much longer to locate that drone. So yeah, that's nice. Top head strap. The Goggles Integra have a strap that goes across the top of your head and across the sides. The Goggles 2 don't have that, but the Goggles V2 did. I just think it gives a nice feeling of extra support. It helps level and balance the entire system on your head, especially with the battery pack in the back. And some of the issues with the smashing of the nose or the bridge of your nose with the Goggles Integra, after dealing with some of that, I found that top head strap in the center, getting that just right can really help improve the comfort that you experience when you're wearing these things. And then lastly, for the good, is lens protection. Lens protection is something that is fairly unique to the Goggles Integra, and here's why. With the Goggles V2, there was no special cover over the lens. The lenses were just in there. You have the IPD sliders, you can move them, but any lens protection was non-existent, stock. You could, of course, buy something to protect it aftermarket. That's fine, whatever. But the Goggles 2 had the integrated diopter adjustment, so you can change the diopter. Everything was built in. But with the Goggles Integra, you have the interchangeable corrective lenses, meaning that if you scratch the lenses that are stock in your Goggles Integra or any of the diopter corrective lenses, you could buy new ones and pop the old ones out and pop the new ones in. So it's kind of a nice peace of mind that if you scratch your lenses, you're not really scratching the lens, you're just scratching the protective or the corrective covering over them. And those are easily replaceable with the Goggles Integra. So nice peace of mind there. Next, let's move to bad. So this is what I would say, in my experience so far with these goggles, they're things that it's not the worst case scenario, not like complete deal breaker. It's just the bad. So let's go through this. The Goggles Integra, I'm sure you've heard, if you've done any research on them, that there is a significantly reduced field of view. It is 41 degrees, I believe, compared to the 51 degrees found on the Goggles 2. And I believe the Goggles V2, it's actually up to 53 degrees. So I'm used to a field of view or FOV up in the 50s. And it was a little bit jarring at first. Going to the Goggles 2 kind of gave me the impression that I was sitting further away from a TV in a room. So even though these goggles were smashed up against my face and the lenses were right in my eyes, the actual screen inside of those goggles was further away than what I was used to with the V2. Didn't take me long to get used to it. And from what I'm hearing from some other people and reviews and whatnot, that actually helps with the optics system that they went with in the Goggles Integra to eliminate blurring around the edges. I wouldn't say it's perfect, but it's not bad. It's completely fine. And if you take the time to get your straps adjusted, you're not going to have any issues with that. I was able to find that sweet spot where everything was in focus, including, my heads-up display or the on-screen display showing things like my battery voltage and all of the other information that shows up as text on your display. It's able to get everything in focus and it looked great. But the sweet spot is a little tricky to find, and depending on your eyes, it might vary slightly for you. The lack of the integrated diopter adjustment seemed like a cool feature, and for me, I don't think it's a deal breaker. I didn't put this in the ugly column because my eyes are good enough to the point where I'm fine with just the IPD sliders. But the fact that if you do need to change any of them, you have to swap physical lenses could be a problem, I suppose. But if you ask me, I kind of like having that built-in lens protection where if you scratch them, you can replace them. So not horrible there. The lack of a dedicated record button on the Goggles Integra at first kind of threw me off, because when I started flying one of my O3 quads, I went for the record button that I'm used to on the V2s and realized, oh yeah, it's not there. And I actually had no idea how to get to it. So I went through menus and I was looking for a record button, couldn't find it. Turns out it was a gesture. So with the Goggles 2, you swipe down. I found that. Bardwell actually replied to a comment that I had on one of his latest videos, and he told me the swipe down thing for the V2, or not V2, the Goggles 2. So got me thinking, and I went and I just hit down on the D-pad, or the joystick on my Integra goggles, and that did it. It brought up a little record overlay, and the record button is right there. So Goggles Integra, joystick down, and then you click the joystick to start recording with the O3. So not a huge deal that it's not there, but I guess it's just two extra steps, or an extra step to start recording. The battery life is still only 2 hours ever since the Goggles 1. So V1, Goggles 1 V1, Goggles 1 V2, Goggles 2, and now the Goggles Integra. It's always been 2 hours. It would have been nice to have seen some extra battery life out of these things, especially since that pack that sits on the back of your head seems like it's bigger. And I did open that up, and it seems like the cells in there are much larger than the cells that are inside of the external battery pack for the V2s. But it's still really only rated at 2 hours of battery life, which it's long enough. And of course you can charge it up with a external power bank and all that. But I would love to have seen, 3 or 4 or 10 hours. So next, lower refresh rate. I'm a specs kind of snob sometimes, and I like higher refresh rates, faster, whatever. But I understand that having that higher refresh rate of 120 hertz versus 100 is really, at the end of the day, not going to make a lick of difference when it comes to flying FPV, unless you are really, really into like racing with digital, which I don't think people would be doing. But still, it's 100 hertz, which is fine. But just since that the V2s have a higher refresh rate, it is kind of a knock against the Integra. But it doesn't bother me, and it really shouldn't bother you. Anyway, next, the lack of 4S LiPo power. So the Goggles 1, both version V1 and V2, had the external power pack, and same with the Goggles 2, I believe, support this, where you can get the official adapter. It's a barrel kind of plug that plugs into the goggles, and then the other end is an XT60 connector, which allows you to power the goggles off of one of your LiPo batteries, which if you fly FPV, you probably have a good amount of LiPo batteries sitting around. So always nice that if your battery pack would die, or your goggles would die, you would be able to, plug in a fresh LiPo to get power without having to go home and charge something. So you can't do that, but you can with the external power bank, so really not a huge deal there. Let's talk about the ugly. So, the fit. The foam sucks. The foam facial interface around the Goggles Integra, and I'm pretty sure it's the same for the Goggles 2, it really is not comfortable. And you can feel it smash the bridge of your nose. It took me a long time, like a good 5 minutes of intentional adjustment of all the straps and all the things, and just where the goggles are actually physically positioned on my head, to get to the point where I thought, yes, this is comfortable now. For that moment. After you fly for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, you start feeling it. Kind of like headphones. If you get new headphones and you wear them, they might seem comfortable, but then you sit and do something for 2 hours, your ears might start hurting. I never had this kind of discomfort with the V2s. I did find a foam interface replacement for those that was very squishy and very comfortable, but there's just a lot more breathing room in the V2 goggles than there is in the Goggles 2 and the Goggles Integra. I have a foam replacement that seems more comfortable coming, that I ordered off of Rotor Riot. We'll see if that does anything. I'm not expecting any kind of miraculous, turnaround there, but worst case scenario, I can deal with it a little bit. It's not a deal breaker that I'm going to go return these things or anything like that. But it is a shame that they're not much more comfortable, because that would be too good, I guess. So just something to consider. Hopefully there'll be some good solutions for that coming out. Hopefully the thing from Rotor Riot works, because that should be coming in the mail soon.
So here is the replacement foam interface that I got off of Rotor Riot for the Goggles Integra here. And it wasn't too difficult to attach this thing. I did have to apply some Velcro adhesive pads, and it really was pretty straightforward. But it was still very uncomfortable on the bridge of my nose with, the way that it came. So I ended up cutting off the part that was right on top of my nose, as you can see in this photo here. And what it did was it gave the room for my nose to breathe in there, and it stopped the pressure. Even though that is hard plastic up in the cavity there where the nose cutout is, my nose is the right size where it's not going to be pressing up against that. So this worked for me. Maybe it'll work for you, but if you have a larger than normal nose, this is probably going to still be uncomfortable for you.
The next one was probably my biggest grievance here. So I have the DJI FPV drone, and it's fun to use. It's a weird drone, but it's fun to use every once in a while. There's no support for it. The Goggles Integra do not support the DJI FPV drone. The V2 is an older protocol. It does. I'm not exactly sure why that is. I'm sure there's a legit explanation somewhere, and it's because the goggles are too new and whatever. But I'm really hoping that there's support somewhere down the line where we can get that back. For now, I will just have to switch back to my Goggles V2 to fly those. Not a huge deal. Like I said, I'm keeping them, but it would have been nice when I'm switching modes between the drones to be able to see the FPV in there, the Avata, the O3, as well as the digital FPV through things like the Caddx Vista. Back to the ugly. When I first plugged in my Goggles Integra, I really went through it. I had to activate them. I had errors. I had network errors with the DJI Assistant. The goggles told me to connect to the DJI Fly app, but doing that, the app was telling me that the device was not recognized. So I was on my Samsung phone, so I tried on my iPhone. It didn't work there either. I had the latest version of the DJI Fly app, at least to my knowledge I did. So I went to the DJI Assistant computer program, and I went to the Consumer Drone series, it was the Consumer Drone series, which is what I saw that you need. And it didn't recognize it there, and I couldn't do anything. Turns out I had to download the latest version of the DJI Assistant Consumer Drone series. And there are like 4 or 5 versions of DJI Assistant out there. You can see why this is in the ugly section. It was not fun activating these things. Furthermore, when I actually did activate the goggles and went to fly my Avata, I got about 50 feet in front of me and the drone stopped, and it told me that maximum flight distance reached. It was because it said connect to DJI Fly app again, and that did not work. It was more of the same, where it was super vague about what it wanted me to do, and then it just said error or unknown device not bound, whatever it was. Short story, long story short. So it was the Avata's firmware I had to update, and it makes sense. I should have done that to begin with, but still, maybe they could have told me that in the app. Be sure you update the firmware, or firmware out of sync or something like that, rather than connected Fly app, device not recognized. It should tell you that kind of thing. But anyway, everything is fine now that I have all the updates done. Everything's activated, all the firmware, everything, and it took a bit, but I got there, and everything's good. And moving on. Non-removable antennas. This is a big one. This is definitely ugly. Now, the removable antennas on the V2 are obvious. They screw out and you can put new ones in. I have a patch system from Lumineer that was a substantial upgrade. I got way better range and penetration out of that system, and it was super easy to install, and it looks awesome. The goggles too. You can pop the antennas out, at least the top 2. The other 2 are integrated. Now, very easy plug and play again, and I don't know if they look cool, but they look different. But those patch antennas, which I'll show one example of those coming up soon, the Goggles Integra appear to have the same foldable antennas as the Goggles 2, but the Goggles Integra goggles are not removable. Not. At least not by normal conventional means, or not as easily as the Goggles 2. So I'm going to show you how I know this and what I saw on Get FPV's website that was more definitive proof that what I just said was true. So let's go take a look. All right, here are the Lumineer adapters plus AX2 antenna upgrade bundle for DJI Goggles 2. So this is meant for the Goggles 2, which appear to have the same kind of stock antennas as the Goggles Integra. But if you scroll down, you'll notice a disclaimer. Important notes. These adapters do not work with the DJI Goggles Integra, as those antennas are non-removable. So there it is, folks. The DJI Integra goggles are not removable. Maybe we'll see some modifications done by some people out there with a way to do it, but usually if it's not meant to be done, I won't typically do it, especially on something that I just spent $500 for. I don't want to risk breaking it unless there's like a very simple tutorial that has a very low risk factor. But overall, though, I'm actually not that upset so far with the range. I haven't noticed anything, significantly worse or anything like that between the Goggles Integra and my V2, even with the V2 that have the patch system. They seem consistent. Of course, it's not going to be perfect. I wasn't expecting, a night and day difference or super massive improvement or anything like that. But overall, for my purposes, it's great, and I don't have any complaints. So now that we're done talking about the antennas, let's go to the last of the ugly here, which is that the Goggles Integra, as well as the Goggles 2, they're not glasses friendly. It's one of the reasons why they have the corrective lenses with the diopter adjustment, everything like that. Unless you have extremely small glasses, you're not going to be fitting them inside of these goggles, at least not comfortably. I don't wear glasses or contacts, so I don't have to worry about that. But if you are someone who does, you might want to either try these things out or check out some content from some people who have glasses and see what their reaction to the diopter and the corrective lenses are. I can't really speak to that, but I know that there are a substantial amount of diopter, the corrective lenses, the assortment that you get with the Goggles Integra. There's a huge assortment. Check out my previous video again. I do have a close-up shot of those, and I'm sure you can find that all over the internet. Last, let's move to the unknown. This is some things that we just can't tell yet because not enough time has passed. I haven't had enough time to use these goggles to really know, and I can't, travel in time. So battery replacement. As we all know, lithium batteries degrade over time. There's no such thing as an everlasting battery. So my question is, as these batteries start to degrade, I'm sure newer, better goggles will be out, and I'll probably just buy those if I'm being honest with myself. But will it be an option for people to replace these? I was inside the battery pack. It's really not that difficult to open. There are 4 screws, and as long as you can pry something, little piece of plastic, you can see the actual batteries inside of the battery pack. And I believe they are soldered in place, but still removable with a pretty simple modification. Not something that I'd be interested in doing again, but I'd be curious, how long are we going to go until people start noticing that the integrated battery pack is starting to lose its capacity holding capabilities? So we shall see, and hopefully that doesn't end up being a problem down the road. Future drones. Curious to see, as DJI continues to produce and manufacture drones, especially FPV drones that would be compatible with the Integra goggles and everything else, and all of the remote ID things that are coming down the pike. So DJI's next FPV drone, whatever it is, I'm assuming it better be supported by the Integra and the V2s for that matter. But it's just going to be curious. I'm going to be curious to see how that all kind of pans out, and if we will see, full support, partial support, if it's going to be like delayed support or anything like that, where the drone comes out and then a couple months later we finally get an update through firmware or something like that. We'll see. Now the Goggles Integra, and I'm not sure if the Goggles 2 have this or not too, but it's listed on DJI's product page that it features Sync Smooth technology, which is supposed to help avoid motion sickness and eye fatigue. Now, I never have really experienced that even with the V2s, but for people who maybe tried FPV before and couldn't because of eye strain, things like that, I'd be curious what their reaction to the Sync Smooth technology is. So we'll have to see if anyone is able to report on that. Future DJI FPV support. As I mentioned already, that the DJI FPV is not supported by the Goggles Integra. Actually, I don't believe it's supported by the Goggles 2 either, but it does work with the Goggles V2. But I would love an explanation as to why that doesn't have support with these newer goggles. Are they trying to just eliminate that drone from existence or something like that? Or is this something that we're going to see through a future firmware update? I hope that's true, because I would love to have one system to rule them all, and that supports all of my drones, especially since it does have bound device recall, where I'm not constantly rebinding. Just if I turn on the goggle and that drone and have it set the right way, that it'll just remember it with no manual binding. That would be amazing. So fingers crossed that we see that update. Caddx Vista audience mode. As I mentioned, I had some difficulty doing audience feed from the V2s patching into the Integra while flying with a Caddx Vista equipped drone. I don't know, again, if I was just not looking in the right place. I really did everything that I'm not new to this system, so I know what I'm doing, but maybe I didn't restart it enough times or something. Or more likely, we'll have to wait for a future firmware update, or maybe that's just never going to be supported. Unknown. Replacement foam, we shall see if that helps with the nose smashing, the bridge smashing, or if someone comes up with a really like super thick foam interface that really makes it comfortable, I would buy it. Smaller headband loops. Between the Goggles V2 and the Integra, the loops that actually hold the strap, so there's one here and there are one on each side, they're smaller than the V2. Which means it could be that the strap, right away, I could tell the strap is thinner on the Goggles Integra than what I'm used to with the Goggles V2. I don't know how easy it's going to be to find one that's thicker. I haven't even looked, but I've been satisfied with the head strap so far. But if I want to update that and get a more comfortable fit or something like that, I'll be curious to see what kind of options are available, since those loops are significantly smaller. Signal range and penetration. I'm not doing range testing. That's not the kind of video I'm looking to create. But I'm sure there are lots of videos on YouTube for that, but I'm just kind of curious. So personally, I don't know. I don't have that information. But as I said, my experience from my flight style and what I use these drones for, I have been fully satisfied. I've been flying through densely wooded areas, across a cornfield. We're looking at probably about a half mile max distance away, with pretty good conditions and mostly good line of sight, with maybe just trees and some rocks in between me and the drone. I haven't done too many building shoots yet with the Goggles Integra, so I'll be interested to see how well that holds up with putting multiple walls between myself, the operator, and the drone while using these Goggles Integra. Okay. Phew, that was a lot. 40 minutes. That's a lot to cover here, but as I said, this is all my opinion. Every single thing on this chart, I developed this chart myself, and this was a result of me using the Goggles V2 for multiple years, flying for over 3 years, and now switching to the Goggles Integra and skipping the Goggles 2 entirely. There's a lot of good stuff here. So a lot more good than bad and ugly combined. And the unknowns are, nothing on here is a deal breaker. I'm happy with the purchase. I don't regret anything. The price point was fantastic. The quality is awesome. And I enjoy using these things. It's exciting to just pull them out, turn them on, and put them on without dealing with the extra hassle of things hanging off my head. And the color is incredible. And just overall, very satisfied with the DJI Goggles Integra. So if you're looking for my advice, should you buy these things? My answer is yes, Absolutely. If you have the goggles 2, probably not. Keep the goggles 2. You're good with those. You can replace your antennas. Good for you. If you have the goggles V1 or the goggles V2, absolutely worth the upgrade. If you don't have any goggles at all, get the Integra. Get the Integra. Don't pay attention to all of the nitpicking that you might be hearing online for everyone that knows everything about absolutely everything. You're going to hear good and bad about anything you look up. So if you are new to the hobby, get the Integra. It's a lot less hassle than you'll deal with, and there's room for expandability. And if you get more than one drone, which, let's face it, if you end up flying FPV, you're going to end up spending a lot of money, and you'll probably end up with multiple drones. It's so convenient to switch between the two and to not have that extra hassle of restarting your goggles every time you want to switch between types of drones, and having that integrated battery and remote ID kind of future-proofs yourself for eliminating frustration that you would encounter with the V2s or the goggles 2. So that's it. I'm going to stop now. This is by far the longest video that I've ever made, so I do appreciate you watching. If you're new, consider subscribing. Please like the video if you enjoyed it. I have a lot of cool drone stuff. I'm making new stuff every single week. And as I said, I have a lot of drones and a lot of ideas. So thanks again for stopping by. I'll see you next time.